June 14, 1934. Venice, the serene republic, draped in summer heat, waits beneath a pale Italian sun. The Grand Canal shimmers with expectation. Water laps against ancient stone. Flags snap in the Adriatic breeze. For the first time, two dictators, the architects of fascism's future, the men who would reshape Europe with iron and ideology, stand facing one another. One in showy military dress, decorated with authority. The other in a rumpled civilian suit, nervous and uncertain. This is not a meeting of equals, though history has long pretended otherwise. This is a collision, and in its aftermath, everything changes. Before this moment, before these two men stood in the drawing room of a Venetian palace, before the monologues and the awkward silences, there existed something far more complex than alliance. There was admiration twisted into contempt. There was ideological kinship strained by personal distrust. There was Hitler's desperate admiration for the man he believed was history's great revolutionary, and Mussolini's growing disgust for what he saw as an Austrian upstart playing with copies of his own genius. To understand what happened in Venice is to first understand what led two fascist dictators to regard each other with such profound suspicion. In the early 1920s, when Adolf Hitler was still an unknown agitator in Munich beer halls, when he scribbled his manifestos in dim light and dreamed of greatness, Mussolini had already seized power. In 1922, the Duce marched on Rome with his blackshirts. He did not ask permission. He took what he believed was his by right of action, by right of will. The crowds cheered. The king capitulated. Within months, Mussolini had transformed Italy into a fascist state, the first of its kind in Europe. He did this while Hitler was still organizing failed putsches, while the Nazi Party was barely a whisper in the Weimar Republic. When Hitler wrote in his manuscript the work that would become Mein Kampf, he openly acknowledged Mussolini as the elder statesman of fascism, the model upon which all future authoritarianism must be built. Hitler praised Mussolini's struggle against Marxism. He cited the March on Rome as proof that determined men could overturn democratic systems. Here was proof that the will of a single extraordinary individual could reshape nations. Hitler was a student learning at a distance. He studied the master's methods like an apprentice studying the craft of revolution. But Mussolini read none of this with the gratification Hitler intended. When Emil Ludwig, a German Jewish writer, visited the Duce in 1932, Mussolini spoke freely of his disdain for Hitler's ideas. He called Mein Kampf boring, a tome so dull he had never been able to finish it. He described Hitler's racial theories as arrant nonsense, stupid and idiotic. Here was the pride of a man who had already remade a nation, who saw in Hitler not a successor to his vision but a crude plagiarist, someone stealing the thunder of true revolutionary genius. Mussolini had the confidence of a dictator who had already proven himself. Hitler remained, in his mind, an untested charlatan with a thick Austrian accent and grandiose pretensions. And yet, Mussolini was also beginning to feel the weight of European isolation. By 1933, when Hitler finally seized power in Germany, international conditions had shifted. The League of Nations, that optimistic body meant to preserve peace, had proven itself toothless and useless. Mussolini harbored his own ambitions. He dreamed of an Italian empire, a new Rome that would rival the ancient glories of his ancestors. His eyes turned toward Abyssinia, one of the few African territories not yet under European control. But this ambition would require German neutrality, and potentially German support. Meanwhile, Hitler had his own obsession, Austria. The small mountainous country that lay between Italy and Germany, the land of Hitler's birth, represented everything he wished to reclaim and transform. He wanted Austria not merely as territory but as proof of his destiny, as the first stone in the edifice of a greater German empire. In the summer of 1933, Mussolini proclaimed Italian protection of Austrian independence. This was a direct warning to Hitler. Austria belonged to Italy's sphere of influence. Any German aggression against Vienna would be answered by Italian force. Mussolini backed this proclamation with tangible support. He sent money to Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a man opposed to Nazi annexation. Dollfuss became, in effect, Mussolini's proxy in Vienna, a Catholic, authoritarian leader who would keep Austria independent and pro-Italian. The two men formed a friendship born of shared opposition to German expansion. They corresponded regularly. Dollfuß's family vacationed in Italy on Mussolini's invitation. The Duce had made his position clear: Austrian independence was a red line. Cross it, and Italy would fight. Yet Hitler could not yet afford such a confrontation. In 1933 and 1934, his rearmament program was still secret, still nascent. Germany's military remained inferior to most European powers. If Mussolini moved troops to the Austrian border and France joined in a coalition against him, Hitler would face catastrophic defeat. Caution, therefore, became necessity. Hitler needed to mend fences with Mussolini, to convince the Italian leader that German interests did not threaten Italian security. And so, in early 1934, Hitler made an unprecedented move. He requested a meeting with Mussolini. This itself was an act of humility. Hitler, now the leader of a major European power, asking Mussolini for an audience, seeking his approval, his blessing, his friendship. Mussolini, enjoying his dominance, agreed. Let Hitler come to Venice. Let the Austrian upstart see the glory of an established fascist state. Let him understand, face to face, which of them was the true revolutionary. On June 14, 1934, Hitler arrived at the Venice airfield. The German press had arranged favorable coverage. The German people would be told that their Führer was meeting with a fellow fascist leader, forging bonds that would benefit the Reich. But Hitler himself understood the precarious nature of the encounter. He was stepping into Mussolini's territory. He would be the guest, the supplicant. And he had made a crucial error: he wore no uniform. He arrived in a rumpled beige trench coat, a civilian suit, carrying a battered fedora, looking, as one observer noted, like a minor office worker rather than the leader of a great nation. Mussolini, by contrast, dressed in full military regalia. His uniform was crisp, his riding boots polished to perfection, his bearing that of a supreme commander reviewing his forces. The contrast was deliberate, calculated, and immediately humiliating. When the two men shook hands, and notably, Mussolini refused Hitler's proffered Nazi salute, instead offering only a formal handshake, observers noted something striking in Hitler's demeanor. There were tears in his eyes. Tears. Here stood Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany, weeping with what witnesses could only describe as religious fervor in the presence of his hero. Mussolini noticed. He filed it away. For all his talk of equality between fascist powers, Hitler had just demonstrated, through those tears, his fundamental sense of inferiority. Mussolini was the master. Hitler was the admiring student. The two men departed for the countryside, away from cameras and crowds. They were driven to Villa Pisani in Stra, a royal palace set back from the Venetian mainland. It was here that the meeting would truly take place, away from the spectacle, in the privacy of staterooms. This is where the collision would occur. And what a collision it was! Within moments, their differences became catastrophically apparent. Mussolini, who spoke fluent German, had chosen to negotiate without a translator, a deliberate choice meant to demonstrate his intellectual command. Yet Hitler's thick Austrian accent, his rapid-fire monologue style, his tendency to work himself into rhetorical frenzies, made comprehension difficult. Mussolini struggled to understand what Hitler was saying. More troubling still, Hitler began to lecture. He talked about his vision for Germany. He spoke of race and destiny. He discussed his plans for Eastern Europe, his ideological framework, his racial laws. He expounded at length about German greatness, about the necessity of space for the German people, about the natural hierarchy of humanity. Mussolini, who had come expecting a diplomatic negotiation between equals, instead found himself subjected to what felt like an ideological sermon from a man who had long proclaimed himself a student of Italian fascism. The Duce grew increasingly bored. Attendants reported that Mussolini sat with visible discomfort, shifting in his seat, checking his pocket watch, his initial hauteur curdling into something approaching contempt. Hitler's monologues, those legendary verbal torrents that would later exhaust subordinates, that would bore generals and cause aides to nod off, had begun. And Mussolini, used to commanding attention through the force of his own personality, found himself being lectured to by a man he considered intellectually inferior. The conversation turned to the matter that had ostensibly prompted the meeting: Austria. Hitler pressed his case. He wanted Mussolini's acceptance, ideally, his support for German hegemony over Austria. He spoke of historical destiny, of the natural union of German peoples, of the necessity of the Anschluss, the annexation. He made his position clear: Germany would eventually move on Austria, with or without Italian consent. It was inevitable. It was written in the racial and historical logic that Hitler believed governed human affairs. Mussolini responded with a categorical refusal. His voice rose. His own legendary temper, a force that had terrified Italian politicians and diplomats, erupted. Italy had guaranteed Austrian independence. Italy would honor that guarantee. If Germany moved on Austria, Italy would meet German troops on the border. There would be war if necessary. Austria was not negotiable. Austria was non-negotiable. Mussolini had allied with Hitler partially because he believed Hitler to be a useful tool, a counterweight to France and Britain, a fellow anti-communist power. But he would not sacrifice Italy's strategic position, he would not allow German dominance in Central Europe, he would not permit his influence in Vienna to be eclipsed by Berlin. The argument escalated. Attendants outside heard shouting. Fists pounded tables. The carefully choreographed civility of state diplomacy dissolved into something raw and primal, two authoritarian personalities clashing, each accustomed to absolute obedience, each now confronted with another will equally unyielding. Finally, unable to resolve the impasse, both men rose. They did not look at each other as they left the room. They walked past each other like enemies who had called a temporary truce, knowing that warfare would resume, that this confrontation had resolved nothing. When they emerged to greet the crowds, because fascism demanded spectacle, demanded the performance of unity and strength, both men smiled for the photographers. They waved. They played their roles. That night, Mussolini addressed crowds in San Marco Square from a balcony. Hitler stood nearby, watching, silent. The Duce spoke with the confidence of a man who had just defeated a rival, who had stood firm against German pressure. The crowds cheered. Hitler observed it all with an expression unreadable to those around him. But what the public saw was theater. The reality was far more complex. The meeting had been a disaster, worse, perhaps, than either man had anticipated. Both returned to their respective capitals convinced they had bested the other, yet both understood that the fundamental contradiction in their relationship remained unresolved. Hitler wanted Austria. Mussolini wanted to prevent him from taking it. These were incompatible objectives. Yet within weeks, an event would occur that would transform the entire calculus of Italian-German relations. On July 25, 1934, just 11 days after the Venice meeting, Austrian Nazis staged a putsch in Vienna. They stormed the Chancellery building. They assassinated Engelbert Dollfuss, Mussolini's friend and ally, shooting him multiple times and then leaving him to bleed out, untended, for 7 hours while he died in agony. The coup ultimately failed, but the message was clear: Hitler, despite his promises to Mussolini, was determined to move on Austria through any means available. Mussolini's reaction was volcanic. He called Hitler a dangerous madman, a revolting individual, a sexual degenerate, and, in a phrase that would outlast him, a gramophone with only 7 tunes, and once he had finished playing them, he started all over again. The Duce had been personally betrayed. He had given Hitler a chance. He had listened to his Austrian colleague. And in return, Hitler had orchestrated the murder of Mussolini's closest ally in Central Europe. It was a humiliation that could not be forgotten, a violation of the basic codes of diplomatic conduct that even dictators theoretically respected. Mussolini immediately mobilized the Italian army. He moved troops to the Austrian border. He made it clear that Italy would defend Austrian independence with military force. Hitler, still weak militarily, still dependent on trade and resources, could not risk war with Italy. He backed down. He disavowed the Austrian Nazis. He claimed ignorance of their plans, though historians have long debated whether his denials were true or merely diplomatic necessity. The putsch was suppressed. Dollfuss's assassination remained unanswered. But Mussolini had won this round. He had shown Hitler that even the leader of Germany must respect Italian interests, that the Mediterranean belonged to the Duce, that Austria would not be taken while Mussolini stood guard. But this victory was ultimately Pyrrhic. Mussolini had succeeded in defending Austrian independence, but he had also succeeded in isolating Italy from Britain and France at precisely the moment when he needed international support. In October 1935, less than a year and a half after the Venice meeting, Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. He wished to build his new Roman Empire. He believed this was his historical destiny. But Britain and France, now alarmed by Italian expansionism, imposed sanctions. They condemned Mussolini's aggression. They threatened economic isolation. And in this moment of crisis, when Mussolini found himself isolated, shunned by the Western democracies, despised by the League of Nations, there stood Hitler offering friendship, offering support, offering Germany as an alternative to British and French hostility. The Austrian question faded in importance. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, and both Italy and Germany intervened on the side of Francisco Franco's fascist rebels. Here, Italian and German troops fought side by side, tested their weapons together, discovered that their military cooperation was not merely possible but effective. They jointly defeated Soviet-backed forces. They proved that German and Italian soldiers could work in concert. The Spanish Civil War became a dress rehearsal for the alliance that was forming. By October 1936, less than 2 years and 4 months after the Venice collision, Mussolini and Hitler formalized the Rome-Berlin Axis. The bitter enmity, the philosophical disdain, the personal antagonism that had characterized their first meeting gave way to pragmatic alliance. Italy and Germany would cooperate. They would support each other. They would coordinate their foreign policies. The Duce, who had once called Hitler a buffoon and a sexual degenerate, now embraced him as a partner in reshaping Europe. What had changed? Not love. Not personal affection. Not even deep ideological alignment. Mussolini still rejected Nazi racial theories, still believed fascism had emerged independently from Italian soil, still harbored doubts about Hitler's judgment and stability. What had changed was circumstance. Mussolini needed Germany because the Western powers had rejected him. Hitler needed Mussolini because, despite his growing military strength, he still feared Italian opposition to his plans in Central Europe. Together, they could project power. Separately, they were vulnerable to the forces arrayed against them. The 1934 Venice meeting had seemed to promise one trajectory: confrontation, rivalry, the possibility of future conflict between the two fascist powers. But the sanctions on Italy, the opportunities in Spain, the evolving international situation, all pushed them together. By 1939, when they signed the Pact of Steel, committing Italy and Germany to full military alliance, the relationship had transformed. Mussolini was no longer the superior, the mentor, the established dictator condescending to an upstart. By 1939, Hitler was increasingly the dominant partner, the one whose will mattered most, the one whose strategic vision shaped the alliance. In Hitler's wartime headquarters later, when Mussolini and Hitler met again in 1943 after Italy's collapse, the symbolic reversal was complete. Hitler, now dressed formally, offered only a handshake to a Mussolini in civilian suit, a Mussolini no longer an equal but a dependent, rescued from prison by German paratroopers, placed in a puppet Italian state, subject to German orders. But all of that lay in the future. In June 1934, standing on the banks of the Grand Canal, watching the water reflect the setting sun, two men faced each other across an abyss of personal incompatibility and ideological tension, each believing himself the true revolutionary, each viewing the other with profound skepticism. Their first meeting was not the beginning of an alliance. It was the collision of two wills that believed themselves destined to command Europe, neither willing to truly subordinate himself to the other, both convinced that time and history would ultimately vindicate their vision. What emerged from Venice was not friendship but a recognition of mutual necessity. It was not the triumph of one ideology over another but the pragmatic calculation that temporary alignment served both their interests better than continued isolation. The tears in Hitler's eyes as he stood before his idol had been real. But they were not tears of devotion. They were tears of a man confronted by the reality of his hero, an aging dictator, vain and temperamental, susceptible to boredom and pique, not the mythic figure of revolutionary legend but a human being with all the contradictions and limitations that entails. The historians would later speak of the Axis as if it were predetermined, as if Hitler and Mussolini were brothers in arms united by a common ideology. But those who lived through 1934 understood a more complex truth. The two men had collided in Venice like asteroids in a cosmic void. Neither had been destroyed. Neither had permanently yielded. Instead, they had bounced off each other, altered in trajectory, sent careening toward a collision with the rest of Europe that would reshape the entire world. Their meeting was not the beginning of alliance. It was the beginning of an escalating dance of power, ambition, and historical consequence that would ultimately lead to the deaths of tens of millions. The water of the Grand Canal remembers that summer, though water has no memory. The stones of Venice have stood for 1,000 years before that meeting and have stood for 1,000 years since. But the brief convergence of two dictators on Venetian soil in the summer of 1934 set in motion events that could not be undone, choices that could not be reversed, a cascade of consequences that transformed Europe and changed forever the course of human history. Two men, each believing himself destined to remake civilization according to his vision, faced each other across a drawing room. They talked. They argued. They revealed themselves to each other. And in that revelation, in Mussolini's contempt and Hitler's tears, lay the seeds of everything that would follow. Want to know how a handshake turned into a war that engulfed millions? Hit that like button and subscribe, because the next chapter is even darker.